Washington Post political correspondent James Hohmann is in Washington and joins us now. All right, James, so lots to get to. What do you make of these latest announcements?
Yeah, Vlad, clearly Trump is filling his administration with billionaires and generals. The billionaires continue to pour in. Obviously, you just mentioned Linda McMahon. Andy is an interesting choice for Labor Secretary. What it really shows is that Trump is going a very traditional, conventional, orthodox, conservative Republican approach to stocking his cabinet. The fact that he chose someone like Scott Pruitt for EPA is very notable because earlier in the week, remember, he met with Al Gore. Yesterday, he met with Leonardo DiCaprio. So there was some suggestion that maybe he would back off a little bit on climate change issues, on the environment. But going with Scott Pruitt, probably the most outspoken elected official against the EPA, someone who brags on his LinkedIn page that he's, the EPA's biggest enemy, shows Trump's going to govern like a very conventional, traditional Republican. So I think that's really the takeaway from all these different picks. And you mentioned President-elect Trump's going to Des Moines, Iowa. He's going to formally unveil Terry Branstad, the governor there, as his ambassador to China. Branstad is a very pro-trade, very traditional Republican. Another kind of data point to show Trump's tacking more toward being a conventional Republican as he governs.
James, I'm curious. So the Sierra Club says having Scott Pruitt in charge of the EPA is like putting an arsonist in charge of fighting fires. But I wonder if there's a method to this. In other words, I'm reminded of FDR when he appointed Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of the future president, as head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And when somebody asked President Roosevelt, why are you putting the guy who has manipulated the stock market? And he said, well, it takes a crook to catch a crook. I wonder, and I'm not suggesting these appointments are anybody that are crooked, but I'm just sort of suggesting that maybe the fact that they are so well versed in some of these matters and have an intimate understanding of some of them, even if they are on the other side of those issues, may be beneficial.
Yeah, I think that's very possible with someone like Trump himself. He is the way he's kind of rattled Boeing's cage this week about the Air Force One contract, the way he threatened companies that move jobs overseas, talked about putting tariffs on China. I think he is challenging some of the norms of how both parties approach governing and approach business. And I think, we try to put him in a box and think of him as super conventional, and maybe Trump himself is different. But when it comes to the people who are going to be running these individual agencies day to day, someone like Pruitt at the EPA, I wouldn't go as far as the Sierra Club did because I'm a neutral observer here, but Pruitt's not someone who's going to say, I understand how the EPA works and therefore I'm going to enhance climate change protections. He's someone who's going to, very upfront that he's going to roll back the Clean Power Plan, which is very controversial and many states opposed, but is sort of the signature environmental achievement of President Obama domestically. And remember the Paris Climate Accord that Obama signed earlier this year, that's not a binding treaty. The United States can pull out of a lot of the commitments there. And so far, Trump's surrounding himself with people who are going to push him to do that. When you're president, there's so many things going on that you really do have to defer, to your EPA person when it comes to environmental regulation. That's something Trump's not going to be dealing with on a day-to-day basis in the Oval Office.
And it's good that you point out that obviously the Sierra Club does have an agenda, and we obviously as reporters do not.
Right.
I want to ask you about something you touched upon earlier. Today, Donald Trump is scheduled to meet with retired U.S. Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He's a former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Is there a concern? We've been talking about this sort of all week, but is there a concern? Are you hearing from people in Washington that there's a concern that Donald Trump already has too many military men in very high-level positions?
There is a concern among some Democrats. There's pros and cons to it. A lot of these military guys, one, in theory, they take orders and will do what they're told. Trump really likes their bravado and their war stories, we're told. But on the other hand, these are very independent people who are very established, are used to running things. James Mattis, the general, the former head of the Marine Corps, he is highly respected by Democrats, but just the sheer number of generals that he's putting into his cabinet has raised some hackles. His Department of Homeland Security secretary is going to be John Kelly, another retired general. James Mattis, we know about. He's looking at David Petraeus for the State Department. Michael Flynn, another retired general, is going to be his national security advisor. So there's going to be a lot of generals. And one of the concerns that you hear from Democrats and a few Republicans is, when you're having conversations about how to deal with a crisis, if you have a bunch of military guys, are you really going to pursue a diplomatic solution, or are you going to pursue a military solution? Now, some military folks say, gosh, the military people know how bad it is to be in combat and war. Maybe they'll be more reluctant to use force. So there's definitely pros and cons to it. There's some Democrats who have actually said they're fine with it. But this is something that everyone on Capitol Hill, frankly, has been talking about the last 24 hours.
James, before I let you go, I want to ask you about this. There's more controversy from that Carrier deal. Chuck Jones, he's the president of the United Steelworkers Local Union that represents Carrier employees, accused Donald Trump of exaggerating the number of jobs the deal actually saved from moving to Mexico. Now, the president-elect then struck back on Twitter, saying Jones was doing a, quote, terrible job representing workers. No wonder companies flee the country. What do you make of this? The president-elect, soon to be the most powerful man on the planet, attacking essentially a citizen, although a citizen who is representing a very large union, and also just more broadly, how the president-elect uses Twitter as sort of a bully pulpit.
Yeah, I think President-elect Trump has a lot to learn. He still has a very steep learning curve. I don't think he fully appreciates how much he elevates his opponents when he goes after private citizens like this. It's one thing to go after big companies like Boeing. It's another to go after an individual. Within 30 minutes of Trump's tweet last night aimed at Chuck Jones, he was receiving threatening calls on his cell phone saying, we know what kind of car you drive. We know who your kids are. That's very, very scary stuff. It's not like Trump was telling people to do that, but words really do have consequences. Yesterday, when Time Magazine published its Man of the Year interview with Trump, he said pharmaceutical prices are too high, prescription drug costs are too high, and all of a sudden the pharmaceutical stocks took a big hit. So I think there's this learning process where, this isn't the campaign anymore. Trump's going to have to be more careful because threats happen. People do listen. People pay attention, and right now he's sort of, in some ways, a baby rattlesnake puts out more venom than an adult rattlesnake because it doesn't know how to control how much venom it puts out. Trump's still learning what it means to be president-elect. Right now, he's like a baby rattlesnake in that respect. He doesn't know his own strength.
And words do matter. James Hohmann at the Washington Post. We appreciate it, James, as always. Thank you.
Thanks, Vlad.